It began with a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from a place no human had ever been. The image showed clouds, coastlines, and the thin curve of the earth. Nothing unusual, except for where it came from. A metal capsule falling from space, parachuting into the Pacific Ocean, its film canister still warm from the vacuum above. The year was 1960. The program was called Corona. Officially, it didn't exist. The capsule was said to be part of a biological research satellite. But inside that polished metal shell was the beginning of something far stranger than anyone imagined. A project not just to watch the enemy, but to see everything. For centuries, humanity had looked up at the stars and imagined gods watching down. The Cold War reversed the gaze. Now mankind was the one staring back from heaven. And in that new vantage point, floating above the clouds, staring down at borders that suddenly looked meaningless, something changed in the human psyche. Power no longer belonged to the nations that built the tallest towers or the biggest bombs. It belonged to whoever could see. That was the birth of the American surveillance empire. The Corona program was born out of fear of the Soviet Union's secrecy, fear of the unknown, fear of blindness. In the 1950s, U.S. intelligence had almost no information on the USSR's nuclear capabilities. American generals were terrified that Moscow might have thousands of missiles hidden in forests, silos, or train cars. Every rumor became a crisis. Every shadow was treated as proof. The Air Force tried to solve it with aircraft. High-altitude, U-2 spy planes flew across Soviet territory, taking photos with cameras the size of telescopes. But the missions were dangerous. Each flight risked sparking war. When one was finally shot down in 1960, and pilot Francis Gary Powers was captured alive, President Eisenhower realized the era of manned spying was over. If the sky was to be watched, it would have to be watched by machines. That same year, the first Corona satellite successfully returned from orbit. Its film capsule splashed down in the Pacific, where it was snatched midair by a passing aircraft, a feat so improbable it bordered on magic. The photos inside were clearer than anyone dared hope. Entire Soviet bases, missile fields, and nuclear test sites were suddenly visible, captured in strips of film only a few inches wide. It was as if God had given humanity the ability to read its own secrets. But with that power came something unexpected: awe. The analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington were the first to experience it. They sat for hours under red lights, studying images of the Earth like astronomers examining distant galaxies. There was something intoxicating about it, the feeling of omniscience, of holding the planet in your hands. And then came the anomalies. The satellites didn't just capture military targets. They photographed everything: deserts, oceans, glaciers, jungles, and clouds. Thousands of frames filled with data, noise, and sometimes things that defied explanation. Analysts began reporting optical artifacts, shapes or lights that appeared where none should exist. Some were reflections, some were distortions caused by radiation or film damage, but not all could be dismissed so easily. In the declassified archives decades later, you can still find the reports: objects hovering over missile ranges, lights moving faster than known aircraft, geometric patterns etched into deserts where no roads existed. Most were likely natural or man-made phenomena, but the pattern was unsettling. The more the U.S. looked, the less it understood. The more you watch, the stranger the world becomes. By the mid-1960s, the Corona satellites had evolved into a new generation of orbiters known as Keyhole, KH-4, KH-7, KH-9, and beyond. Each was capable of sharper resolution, longer missions, deeper insight. One Keyhole camera could photograph a single object the size of a car from 100 miles above Earth. The entire planet was becoming a film strip, mapped in microscopic detail. But something else was happening, quietly, in the minds of those who worked with the images. They began to talk about the eye, not metaphorically, as a technical system. The eye saw everything, but it also chose what to see. That choice came from the humans who fed it coordinates and missions. Over time, that decision-making became automated, guided by early computers that could predict orbital paths and lighting conditions. The first glimmer of machine vision was born. And with it came a question that would haunt every generation after. What happens when the act of watching no longer requires a watcher? The men running the Corona and Keyhole programs didn't have time for philosophy. They were engineers, soldiers, and analysts. Their job was to keep America alive. But deep down, many of them understood that they were building something that would outlive their purpose. The eye didn't blink. It couldn't. In Langley, in Los Angeles, in the desert testing grounds of Nevada, teams worked around the clock to improve its vision. They tested infrared photography, multispectral scanning, and radar imaging. They built lenses so powerful they could read the date on a newspaper from orbit. The secrecy was suffocating. Each satellite launch was disguised as a weather mission. The scientists signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements. Even their families didn't know what they were working on. To the public, the space race was about exploration, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. But behind the scenes, another race was unfolding, to master omniscience. The moon was for glory, orbit was for control. The irony is that the more clearly the satellites saw, the less clearly the people who used them could explain what they saw. When the Keyhole 9 system began operating in 1971, its cameras revealed things no one expected: massive underground complexes, strange heat signatures beneath the Siberian tundra, mysterious geometric fields stretching for miles. Most turned out to be natural formations or mining operations. But for a brief moment, the world above looked alien. And then something even stranger happened. The same satellites built to spy on the Soviet Union began to notice anomalies in space itself. Strange bursts of light appearing over the South Atlantic, flickers on the film that couldn't be explained by cosmic rays, radiation belts that pulsed like living things. The CIA analysts nicknamed them angels. It was half joke, half admission. No one knew what they were. When you stare into the void long enough, the void begins to move. For the intelligence community, this was an inconvenience. The goal was to monitor human threats, not celestial mysteries. But for the scientists quietly assisting the program, it was revelation. The data from the spy satellites began feeding into atmospheric research, climate modeling, even astronomy. The same instruments built for war were being used to study creation. It was said, only half seriously, that America had accidentally built the first telescope aimed back at Earth, and found not the enemy, but itself. By 1972, there were over 100 secret satellites in orbit. Each one whispered data down to Earth in streams of encrypted code, painting a digital portrait of a planet under constant observation. The surveillance infrastructure we live with today, GPS, imaging satellites, reconnaissance networks, all trace their ancestry to those early keyholes. And yet, buried beneath the layers of classified reports, there was always something else: the question of meaning. What did it mean to see everything but understand nothing? Among the intelligence analysts who processed the satellite photos, stories began circulating about the Black Vault, a nickname for a classified archive said to contain images and data too strange or ambiguous to file elsewhere. The existence of the vault was never confirmed, but everyone believed in it. It was where the inexplicable went to die. Not because anyone wanted to hide proof of the unknown, but because the unknown didn't fit into the language of national security. You can't categorize mystery in a system built on certainty. The vault, if it existed, wasn't a physical room but a mindset, a recognition that in trying to see everything, the watchers had started seeing ghosts. As the Cold War deepened, the line between intelligence and mythology began to blur. Some in the program whispered that the satellites had captured evidence of nuclear tests no nation claimed, or strange lights under the polar ice. Others said they'd seen photos of the same cloud formation repeating in identical shape months apart, a meteorological impossibility. Most of it was nonsense, but not all of it. A few of those anomalies made their way into legitimate scientific studies. One became the discovery of the South Atlantic anomaly, a weak point in Earth's magnetic field that bombarded satellites with radiation. Another helped map global warming patterns decades before climate change became a household term. The eye had revealed more than its creators expected. And with every revelation came a paradox. The more America tried to spy on its enemies, the more it ended up studying the Earth itself, the oceans, the clouds, the stars. The act of surveillance had transformed into something closer to theology. Because what else do you call it when you build a machine that can see everything? The people running the Corona and Keyhole programs believed they were protecting humanity, but they were also, in a strange way, defining it. The images they captured became the first true self-portraits of the species, the blue planet hanging in blackness, the fragile veil of atmosphere, the scars of civilization visible from orbit. It was a kind of revelation, a proof that the divine view didn't belong to gods after all, it belonged to engineers. And yet, even as the cameras sharpened, something remained hidden, something the eye couldn't see. By the mid-1970s, the satellite network had grown so vast it could track the movement of individual vehicles across continents. But it still couldn't predict what people would do. The photographs showed tanks, not intentions. That realization haunted the intelligence community. Omniscience wasn't omnipotence. You could see the future forming, but not change it. The satellites didn't save anyone from war, or famine, or fear. They only gave those things context. And yet the watchers kept watching. Because once you've seen from above, you can never go back to blindness. By the mid-1970s, the satellite network had grown so immense that analysts could no longer process what it captured. Every orbit brought back millions of frames of film, each one a tiny frozen heartbeat of Earth. The National Photographic Interpretation Center overflowed with data. Analysts slept at their desks. Corridors were lined with boxes of undeveloped negatives. The eye had grown too powerful for the mind behind it. The solution was automation. Early computers were introduced to scan images for patterns, airfields, runways, missile silos. Algorithms, crude by modern standards but revolutionary for their time, learned to recognize the geometry of war. Within years, the machines were flagging more anomalies than the humans could review. And that was the problem. Buried in the flood of imagery were the strange ones, symmetrical shapes in deserts, glowing streaks in the night sky, shadows where no structures existed. Most were explained as sensor errors or reflections, but a few weren't. Analysts called them the unclassifiables. When the unclassifiables piled up, they went into the same drawer, marked with a single code, BV1. No one said what it stood for, but everyone knew. The Black Vault. It was the government's junk drawer for the incomprehensible. Photos that could neither be explained nor erased. One former technician, interviewed decades later, described it like this. It wasn't supernatural. It was just uncomfortable. Things that didn't fit the story we were telling ourselves about how the world worked. That story, the story of perfect knowledge, was cracking. The men and women working on the Keyhole and Corona programs began to feel something like vertigo. Every day they saw the whole planet in strips of film, yet the more they saw, the less meaning it had. The Earth looked empty from above, vast, still, godlike. From orbit, humanity disappeared. You could photograph an entire continent and not capture a single soul. Some analysts called it the loneliness of the eye. Psychologists were quietly brought in to monitor staff for burnout. A few were reassigned after reporting existential fatigue. One memo, still partially redacted, described a loss of moral clarity stemming from prolonged exposure to God's eye perspective. The irony was that the closer America came to all-seeing vision, the less it could bear to look. Outside the walls of secrecy, the world was changing fast. The Vietnam War had shattered public faith in government. Watergate had revealed the extent of domestic surveillance. Civil rights leaders were being monitored, anti-war protests infiltrated, phone lines tapped. The same technology built to watch the Soviets was now quietly watching Americans. Congress demanded oversight. Committees were formed. But the intelligence agencies were too deeply entangled in secrecy to untangle themselves. Every revelation led to another layer of classification. The eye blinked, but it never slept. Then came the satellites that could see at night. Infrared sensors, radar imaging, heat detection. The planet glowed like a living organism. You could trace the movement of cars by their exhaust, ships by their wakes, even the breath of cities through the warmth of their lights. To the intelligence community, it was a triumph. To the scientists, it was a revelation. They realized that, for the first time in history, humanity could measure its own heartbeat. Every flicker of power, every light bulb, every smokestack was visible from orbit. You could watch civilization breathe. You could see the pulse of progress and pollution, creation and decay. And yet, the more clearly they saw, the harder it became to separate beauty from horror. One scientist wrote in a private journal, later declassified, "At this distance, cities look like constellations. You can't tell the difference between a power plant and a burning village." That sentence was quietly circulated among the project staff. It became an unspoken mantra, a reminder that omniscience erases empathy. By the late 1970s, the original Corona program had ended, replaced by new systems like KH-11, satellites that no longer used film at all. Instead, they transmitted digital images directly to ground stations in near real time. For the first time, the watchers could watch without waiting. It was intoxicating. It was also terrifying. The flood of information became unstoppable. Every second brought new data, live feeds of war zones, borders, nuclear sites. The Cold War was now being fought not in trenches or skies, but in screens. The Earth itself had become a theater of observation. Somewhere along the way, the watchers stopped asking why. Because the real question, the one buried under the layers of secrecy, was no longer about what the enemy was building. It was about what we were becoming. When the first image of Earth from space was shown publicly, the famous blue marble photo taken by Apollo 17, the world gasped. It was beautiful, fragile, alive, but the men who had already been looking at Earth for years didn't gasp. They felt something colder. They had already seen it through the eye, stripped of color, stripped of wonder. For them, it was old news. And that realization scared them. Because when the miraculous becomes routine, reverence dies. In their pursuit of omniscience, they had accidentally desensitized themselves to the sacred. Among the declassified documents from the 1980s, one stands out. It's a memo from a senior CIA analyst to his director. It reads, "We now have the capacity to see everything on Earth. What we lack is the capacity to care about it." That line could have been written by a priest, not a spy. And maybe that's the point. The Black Vault, whatever it truly was, wasn't about aliens or anomalies or conspiracies. It was about faith. The quiet, aching kind that arises when science trespasses into territory once reserved for religion. The engineers who built the satellites never set out to spy on God. But in their own way, they did. They pointed their lenses into heaven and found it mechanical, endless, silent. The Cold War demanded omniscience. The human soul demanded meaning. The two were never meant to coexist. By 1980, the surveillance infrastructure had become a parallel universe of its own, invisible to civilians, sustained by secrecy, worshipped by those inside it. Entire careers were spent maintaining systems that couldn't be acknowledged. The engineers joked that they were building miracles in the dark. Meanwhile, strange things began happening in the public consciousness. Reports of unidentified flying objects peaked. People across the world claimed to see lights in the sky, moving in patterns too precise to be natural. Most were experimental aircraft, projects like Oxcart and Aurora. But a few may have been spy satellites catching the sun at just the right angle, reflecting briefly before vanishing. The heavens had become crowded, and humanity, for the first time, was seeing its own reflection there. The watchers had built an artificial constellation, one made not of stars, but of machines. For the ancient world, the sky had always been the realm of gods. Now it was the realm of governments. The orbits above Earth were full of eyes, each one staring down, recording, remembering. No wonder people began to feel haunted. When theologians first saw images from orbit, some remarked that humanity had finally climbed into the throne of its own mythology. "We have taken the place of angels," one priest wrote, "and found there is nothing to say." That line made its way into the archives of the National Reconnaissance Office, the agency that oversaw America's satellite programs. Someone underlined it in red ink. The Black Vault wasn't just a collection of strange photos. It was a state of mind, the growing realization that the power to see everything brings you no closer to understanding anything. And so, as the 1980s arrived and the Cold War reached its technological peak, the watchers began turning their gaze inward again. They weren't just monitoring the Soviets anymore. They were mapping the Earth itself, the ozone layer, the melting ice, the scars of deforestation. For all its secrecy, the surveillance network had accidentally become the foundation of modern environmental science. The satellites had seen the apocalypse coming, just not the one they were built to detect. The warheads might never fall, but the planet was burning all the same. When those findings reached the desks of political leaders, they were filed under scientific analysis, non-priority. But the scientists knew. The data didn't lie. The same technology built to spot mushroom clouds was now watching the slow, invisible disaster of human progress. And in the heart of the intelligence community, some began to question whether the greatest enemy had ever been a nation at all. It was humanity itself, reckless, brilliant, and blind. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was dying, but the eye was alive. It no longer belonged to any one agency. The satellites, sensors, and databases had merged into a single nervous system, global, automatic, eternal. What began as an act of desperation to see an enemy had become an instinct. Humanity had learned to look everywhere, all the time, without ever blinking. And like all instincts, it couldn't be undone. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the military justification for total vision collapsed with it, but the machinery remained. The satellites didn't stop orbiting. The cameras didn't stop watching, and so, for the first time, the eye needed a new reason to exist. It found one: us. The surveillance network turned inward. The same systems that once searched for silos and submarines now mapped cities, tracked weather, guided planes, and eventually watched people. The Cold War's omniscient architecture became the backbone of the modern Internet, the GPS network, and real-time imaging. The dream of total vision had survived. It had just changed owners. The Black Vault, that mythical archive of anomalies and unclassifiables, faded into legend. But the mindset behind it became policy. The goal was no longer to explain mystery, but to erase it. Every unknown had to become data. Every event, a point on a map. Every person, a signal in a feed. The eye had learned not just to see, but to understand patterns, and to predict them. That shift, from observation to prediction, was the true turning point. In the 1990s, as computers grew faster and data storage exploded, intelligence agencies realized they didn't need to wait for photographs from orbit anymore. They could process streams of information in real time, build models of behavior, and anticipate actions before they happened. It was, in a sense, prophecy by algorithm. And it worked, too well. The more the eye saw, the more it believed it understood. The machines began interpreting the world with confidence that no human could match. A missile launch, a heat signature, a network spike, everything could be quantified, categorized, predicted. But just like the analysts who once stared too long at the Earth and saw ghosts, the algorithms began seeing patterns that weren't really there. False positives multiplied. Machines hallucinated meaning where none existed. The watchers had built a new black vault, one made not of film and folders, but of code. A digital archive of errors and anomalies, forever expanding, forever inconclusive. And this time, it wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. The irony is that the dream of total vision, the Cold War fantasy of all-seeing power, didn't die with the Soviet Union. It evolved into everyday life. Cameras on streets, satellites in orbit, sensors in phones. Every digital trace we leave behind, every step, click and whisper, feeds the modern eye. We've normalized omniscience. We built it into convenience. The watchers don't hide in bunkers anymore. They sit behind dashboards, algorithms, and corporate logos. The eye no longer reports to generals. It reports to whoever can afford the data. And yet the same feeling remains, that ancient, quiet dread of being seen. The same dread that once haunted radio operators listening to the Russian woodpecker. The same awe that gripped the engineers watching their first satellite photos develop in red light. The same question that haunted the priests and poets long before the Cold War ever began. If we can see everything, who's left to see us? That question became the spiritual aftermath of the surveillance age. Because in trying to make the unknown visible, humanity had turned the visible into the unknown. You can see the whole Earth in a browser window now. Zoom in on cities, mountains, even the backyard of your childhood home. But that power no longer feels miraculous. It feels empty. Because the closer we come to knowing everything, the further we drift from understanding it. The watchers of the Cold War built machines to prevent apocalypse. The watchers of today built them to predict attention. The technology is the same, cameras, code, calculation, but the target has changed. It's not missiles anymore. It's meaning. The eye no longer guards us from the end of the world. It measures how long we'll look at it. In the 1960s, a photograph from orbit was sacred. Today, millions are taken every second. The miracle has been cheapened by repetition, but that doesn't make it any less profound. It only makes it invisible. The eye still watches. We've just stopped noticing. There's a line, buried in an old declassified briefing from the 1970s, written by an anonymous analyst. The eye is not a machine. It is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we believe we deserve to see. That line may be the truest description of surveillance ever written. Because the Cold War wasn't just a battle of weapons, it was a battle of visions. Both sides wanted to see everything, control everything, know everything. And in doing so, they created something that outlived them all, a self-sustaining gaze, a machine religion that worships information instead of salvation. Today, the satellites built by Corona and Keyhole have been replaced by newer, sharper eyes. They orbit higher, process faster, and feed data directly into artificial intelligence. The machine now interprets the Earth the same way humans once interpreted Scripture, searching for patterns, writing meaning into chaos. But the faith is the same. The Cold War engineers believed in deterrence through knowledge. Modern technologists believe in control through data. Both are forms of faith, the belief that if you can just see enough, you'll finally understand the world. But the Black Vault still exists, not as a building or a secret archive, but as a digital reflection of our confusion. It's the space between what the machine knows and what we can explain, the ghosts of our algorithms, the noise that won't resolve into truth. And maybe that's where the divine still hides, not in what we see, but in what refuses to be seen. The most unsettling thing about omniscience isn't that it reveals everything. It's that it erases mystery, and mystery is where meaning lives. That's the tragedy of the eye. It showed us the entire world and made it feel smaller. Somewhere in the archives of the National Reconnaissance Office, among the millions of images and data streams, there's a photograph of the first sunrise ever captured from orbit. It shows a thin blue line, the edge of Earth's atmosphere, curving against the darkness of space. The photo is blurry, grainy, imperfect, but for a moment, it's transcendent. That image isn't classified anymore, you can find it online. But the people who took it never saw it as art. For them, it was just another frame in a reel of thousands, another line of evidence in a war that never came. And yet, looking at it now, it feels sacred, because it captures the exact moment humanity crossed a threshold, the moment we stopped looking up and started looking down. The moment we became the gods we once feared. The Cold War may be over, but its machine, heaven, endures. The eye is still there, drifting silently above us, watching oceans, cities, clouds, and below, billions of smaller eyes, cameras, phones, sensors, mimic its gaze, feeding its hunger for sight. We built a world where everything is visible, and yet we've never felt more unseen. Because maybe, in trying to spy on God, we only discovered that we had replaced him. The Black Vault, how America tried to spy on God, the story of how mankind reached for the divine and ended up photographing its own reflection.